All right, everybody, welcome back. Fredericksburg 155 Live. We're really happy to be here, and we're happy you're joining us. Before you do anything else, while we're just doing this introductory stuff, click share. Share this on your page. We want as many people to see it as possible. In fact, if enough people don't see it, we won't keep doing them. So share this as best you can. I'm Gary Edelman. That's Chris White behind the camera. Good. And we're here with a multitude of guests as well. Let me bring on Pete Mogul. He's a ranger here at the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. Thanks for having us and joining us, Pete. We've got Dan Davis from Emerging Civil War. We've got Chris Makowski from Emerging Civil War, and author of 1,741 books on the Civil War, and Frank O'Reilly, Fredericksburg expert as well. And that's Connor Townsend behind the camera as well, helping out with some of our social media experts. Hit her with your questions as we go. We'll do our best to answer them. We are going to talk about the river crossings, namely the upper river crossing where we are, and then get through town, talk about the urban combat and the fascinating fight, and of course a little bit about Barksdale's Mississippians. What should we start with, Pete?
Well, I guess I saw what you had before at Chatham and all, and I guess one of the main things to understand here is that I get asked a lot about is why didn't the Union artillery just blow the Confederates right out of town? And for modern artillery capabilities, that's pretty easy to think it could happen, but for Civil War artillery, it's not that simple. Chris used a good analogy about trying to kill a fly with a pistol, and that's kind of what these guns were doing. Even though they were rifled and they had, accurate capabilities, they were not able to pinpoint small pockets of resistance all the way across the river in these houses along the riverbank in Fredericksburg. So that bombardment didn't have the desired effect. It did destroy about 100 structures, maybe 10% of the buildings in town, but it didn't drive out Barksdale's Mississippians, who had been well dug in for several weeks before this. They'd chosen cellars, and they dug rifle pits, and they blockaded some of the streets, so they were ready for this. And when that bombardment opened up on them, it didn't really have the effect the Union Army was looking for.
Good. And where are we right now anyway? This is the Rappahannock River, right? And what's behind us?
You got it. Yeah. So up on the bank is Chatham, where y'all were just a little while ago. Now the Union guns weren't right at Chatham. Actually, they were all along the sides of it, so all along the heights over there, overlooking the town. And then you have the Rappahannock itself right here. A little bit different today than it would have been 150 years ago, but still a substantial body of water to go ahead and negotiate. And then we're standing on the spot where Union troops first made landfall as they rode across the river, which we'll talk about in just a moment, and rushed up into the city itself.
One of the things that I really like about being down on this spot, it's a little sliver that the Park Service owns, and it lets you come right down to the river, and you can look over the bank down into the river. So understanding the topography is going to be really important for understanding this portion of the battle and how it unfolds. But the other thing you can see down here, the river looks nice and flat. You can see some mud flats down in that direction. And a lot of people say, look how shallow it is down here. You can clearly see the bottom. Why didn't they just walk across the river? But of course, the river here is affected by the tides. And so when the tide comes up, the river gets deeper. And when it goes out, the river gets more shallow. Up around the bend is the fall line. There, the river is also extremely shallow, but it's rocky. So imagine, you can probably walk across, but can you get your artillery across? Can you get your wagons across? Here, it'll get mired down in the mud. Up there, it can break on the rocks. So it's not easy to just walk across the river, even though a lot of people tend to think it is. And you can get a really good vantage point of that from down here at this particular spot.
I think that's a great point. And we have a great picture here in the 99 Historic Images of Civil War Fredericksburg book. Some of you all will recognize the very famous mill you often see, and of course the is that a railroad bridge, Chris White?
Yep, that's
ruined railroad bridge. Well, you look all the way down here, and here we are, way in the upper corner at the upper crossing here. Chris, do you have any insight? Can we see the middle crossing from here too, or is that further off to the left?
The middle crossing will be right in this general vicinity.
Very cool.
Very down in this area, and we'll be visiting that at our next Facebook Live.
Now, this is a several plate panorama that you can see if you download the right pictures from the Library of Congress. If you're not using the Library of Congress to look at your Civil War pictures, you should start, because man, they have a good portion of all of the documentary photos, about 10,000 photos that we know were taken during the Civil War.
I want to bring Frank in here for a second, because he's been interpreting this piece of ground for a long time, and I want to ask Pete this question too. Landscape restoration that took place here just a few years ago has really changed the perspective from this spot along the river. You want to talk about that?
Absolutely. What people used to look at a place like this as very isolated and without any context whatsoever. But once they opened up all the ground on the other side, they not only got a chance to see Chatham from the Fredericksburg side, but they got a chance to realize how very close the Union Army and its artillery was to the riverfront and the city itself. So now people have an appreciation that the battle was right here in their face, as opposed to being some remote idea elsewhere.
And Pete, what is it you like about being down here on the river?
Well, I think you can really get a feel by standing here of what the first troops who come over are going to go ahead and experience. And one of the stories we'll talk about is how, as the Union troops do something that had never really been done before in American military history, which is cross a river under fire, they're coming up with this as they go along. There's no protocol for it. General Burnside, he does not want to allow this to happen because he feels that it could be murder. He feels that this is like a suicide mission, but he does take volunteers. And as those volunteers row across the river, the fire slackens. You'd think that as they get closer to the enemy that they're actually going to sustain higher casualties. But because of the nature of this terrain, how steep it is, that the Confederates up on the top here in the buildings, they can't see right down into the water below here. So as the Union soldiers get closer to the bank, they actually get safer, which seems like it'd be counterintuitive. But the Union troops, as they come across in those boats, only suffer one killed in action, good number of wounded, but we'd assume it'd be much more than that based on the nature of what goes on.
The ground actually shields them as they come. You get closer, and the ground slopes down in such a way that they can't depress their rifles down far enough to get these guys as they come forward. So the ground actually helps them. And if you got right up to the edge, you can see it's a pretty steep drop-off right there. And I don't want Chris to go plummeting into the river, but you could see how that serves as a shield from anybody who's up there on top of the bank in those houses.
Well, we just got two comments of people that do want Chris to go plummeting into the river, which is pretty interesting.
Wow, Frank was fast.
I wouldn't say that, but this is really interesting, and it's maybe tough to say on a Facebook Live, but this is why there's no replacement for coming out to the ground where it happened. It might seem on a map really easy. Why couldn't Barksdale get that away? But I think your points are excellent here, because I would have never thought until I came here about how steep this is and how it provides actual cover for the boats. How many battlefields has this happened on where you stand at Devil's Den and see the big bank of the triangular field, or where somebody occupies the military crest instead of the crest so they can maximize their field of fire? Some might say that they should have built earthworks here, but this is 1862, and maybe kept them away better here, but then they would have been more exposed.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that the Confederates actually want them to start building those bridges. They don't really try to discourage that bridge building right off the bat, because they want the Federals to commit. And so those bridges are actually going to get a good halfway across that river before the Confederates do anything about it, because that way the Confederates know where the Federals are going to be. So they actually try to encourage this bridge building to take place.
Really cool. Make sure you're hitting us with your questions. We know many of you all are really interested in the Mississippians, the pontoon story. What parts of the pontoon bridge story are we missing? Am I right that sort of no one was crazy about leading this expedition and someone sort of stepped up to the task?
Well, you have the engineers who are actually building the pontoon bridges, and then as far as the volunteers who row across the river, the term voluntold is probably more. The way that goes down is that, like I said, Burnside doesn't want to order it, but he will take volunteers, and the brigade commander, Norman Hall, he's a colonel, he's on the other side there, and he hears this conversation that actually goes down between, I guess the engineers thought of this idea but didn't pose it to Burnside. Henry Hunt, the Union artillery commander, is the one that actually is going to go and take it and run with it, probably because his artillery is not doing their job and he wants to somehow see what the next option is. But this Union infantry brigade commander hears this conversation, and he says that he has a regiment that would be willing to take on this task. That's the 7th Michigan. And they have been, I guess, they cheer when he turns to them and says, are you willing to do this? They raise a cheer, which at that point it's like, okay, I guess these guys are ready for this. They know what it's going to entail, and they're going to take it on. So, but they're told all they got to do is run to the boats, and that the engineers will take care of all the job of rowing them across. And,
I love this. Hashtag Civil War voluntold. Way to go. You're starting it up here. I've also got Jen Jack saying that we are speaking the truth. That's her spelling, not mine. And thanks, Don Moody, for saying that people should support the Civil War Trust. We agree. You totally should. So what else are we, before we move on, we got lots to cover, but is there anything we need to cover while we're here?
So up at Chatham, there are a couple of deep ravines on either side of the property, and those are the ravines that the engineers use to get the pontoon boats down to the river. And remember, they're having to manhandle these things that are like a ton apiece through these ravines down to the river. They get them to the river, and then they have to float them into place. And so that means, of course, the first couple are going to be easy to get right in next to the bank, but then you got to kind of row them out and kind of float them down in and lay down the planking, lash them together, and slowly extend the bridge in that direction. On the morning of the 11th, this valley is going to be filled with fog. It's going to be cold. There's going to be a thin layer of ice along the edge of the banks. So it's going to be cold, quiet work. The engineers are hoping that the fog is actually going to muffle the sounds of what they're doing, because they still think they've got the element of surprise on their side. But unfortunately, the Confederates know what's up, and they're actually trying to let this happen. They let these bridges get out some halfway into the river.
Yeah, something to keep in mind is that, this is going to, a reoccurring theme here is a lot of firsts, and these are not combat trained engineers. These are engineers who are used to building fortifications and structures far away from any danger. So this is way outside their comfort zone, hence the reason why they're trying to do it at night, hence why it might have taken longer than they expected, because building a bridge in the dark is probably going to take longer than it does during the daytime. And then another good point is that since, Barksdale's Mississippians are waiting on this, Barksdale, this is something to keep in mind throughout all this, Barksdale has specifically been told to delay, but do not prevent the Union Army from coming across the river. So keep that in mind. We're to buy time, but Lee feels so confident in the strength of his defensive positions here, he does not want to keep the Union Army from attacking him. He just wants to give them a hard time as they're going about coming across the river. So all important points that I think.
Very cool.
And I think that's really important to remember, because when Burnside got here and he was stymied on the far side of the river, and he's trying to figure out, what do I do? Okay, I've lost the element of surprise. He looks downriver, he looks upriver. He finally decides he's going to cross here after all, and so Lee anticipates that, and he sets up those defenses that Pete talked about. So if Burnside pulls up and decides to shift in one of those other directions after all, Lee has to give up this great defensive position he has. So he wants Burnside to come across here.
But lots of cool stuff going on. Let me hit with 3 questions here, and I'm going to hit them all at the same time. Let's see. How many casualties on the Union side? Who invented the pontoon bridge? And hashtag George Washington silver dollar. What do those things mean?
I'll take the George Washington story. That falls sequentially, I guess. So just a little ways south of here, maybe 2 miles south of us, is a site known as Ferry Farm, where George Washington spent his formative years. I would say from about age 5 to maybe 14 or so. And during that time is when he would have done some of these things we hear about in George Washington legend and lore. If he did throw a coin across a river, it probably would have been the Rappahannock. If he did cut down a cherry tree, it probably would have been in that time period of his life. Ferry Farm is a great site. They just rebuilt what they think Washington's boyhood home looked like after doing a lot of research on that. So that's something very exciting to go and check out. If you're in the Fredericksburg area, I would highly recommend it. Who invented the pontoon bridge and the other question? I will defer those.
Chris knows 100%. There's zero doubt. Go ahead.
I'm going to punt on the casualty question, but as Pete mentioned, only one federal soldier gets killed crossing here, and a lot of guys get wounded, in part because those pontoon bridges are built for stability. They've got square bows and they're long. They don't have the pointed prow that allows them to cut quickly across the river. So it's not a speedy crossing, which makes those guys sitting ducks out there. That's why there are so many casualties, so many wounded guys, but only one killed in action. But as far as the rest of the casualties, well, I want you to tune back in and type in what casualties are you looking for. We know that Fredericksburg is the biggest lopsided loss for the Federal Army, some 13,000 casualties by the end of the battle, compared to only some 5,000 or so Confederate casualties. So you're looking at a particular spot in the field, particular engagement overall. So type in your question. We want all the questions you folks have there. Let us know, and we'll do the best we can. As far as who invented the pontoons, I don't know. Anybody else know?
Yeah, they go all the way back to the times of Romans. So the Romans are crossing the Rhine River in ancient times to do that. So it's not the U.S. Army. They just try to make them better.
You're either hearing the voice of God or the voice of Chris White.
And to some people in the education department, they're one and the same. Connor, come on.
We do have another question from Mary. She asked, were the pontoons that were used here, did they come from Brunswick, Maryland?
Yes, they did, and that's where I live, except it was called Berlin back then. So there's lots of photos taken of that pontoon bridge in Brunswick. Of course, it gets hung up in Washington. Blame Henry Halleck, blame Burnside, blame who you'd like if you go. But the answer is yes. Let's keep moving. And before we move too far, just enjoy this view here, because we are looking at the exact Union view, right, Pete?
Yeah, so if you can imagine, if you're going to put yourself in the footsteps of these Michiganders as they make landfall and try to rush up this hill, the buildings on the top of the rise here, those are still full of Confederates. But now these Michiganders, they can come up and take shelter under the brink of this. And now the Confederates are kind of at a disadvantage because they're going to be surrounded. Now they're holed up inside these buildings, and they are going to be able to be cut off and kind of rounded up by these federal troops who end up taking a large amount of prisoners. As they're making their way up here, the commander of the, it's devolved upon a major, the lieutenant colonel who's in command of the Michigan regiment as they come across is wounded in the boats. He tells them to take no prisoners, to give no quarter. These guys are a little frustrated, as you can imagine. So as they rush up here, they're a bit fired up, and they're probably ready to go ahead and get these Confederates out of these buildings as quickly as possible.
What do we know? Are these some wartime houses up here on the streets, guys?
Most of these are rebuilt because the damage was focused on this area here. The artillery fire did a number on most of the buildings. When you look at the historic photographs, those are the ones that you see that are mainly shot up. The Union artillery was using explosive shell at certain points so they could start fire to these structures. The solid shot wasn't doing the job. The solid shot would kind of just knock a hole in a wooden building and go out the other side. And unlike a brick structure, which is going to go ahead and crumble and fall, that's why the Union artillery is having some complications here.
Okay, well, we're going to want to set up the urban combat in just a second because they don't just show up here and then walk their way toward Marie's Heights, but I see a couple of kind of monuments around here.
I have been excited all day to be able to show people this monument over here in particular.
Well, you're the only one here who's excited.
Well, you know why? So this is a monument that was put in by the UDC, and it says Federals crossed here on the pontoon bridge December 12th and 13th. They got the dates wrong. But today's December 12th, and the monument says December 12th, so now we can finally have something that matches up. The UDC forecast 155 years in the future, but now we're here at the pontoon site.
And accurately predicted the exact dates of our Fredericksburg 155 live, so we appreciate that as well.
But a much more impressive monument sits over here, and this depicts in bas relief. This predicts in bas relief the pontoon crossing. And you get a sense of how chaotic it was. You can see up close that the bridge is just partway built. And you've got engineers that are trying to do the job out there. But of course, every time they'd get out there, and Barksdale sharpshooters would start picking them off and then run back to safety. And then the sharpshooting would stop. They'd come back out, keep building, get shot at again, and run back to safety. And that's why Henry Hunt opens up with the artillery here. That's why eventually he's going to send the pontoons full of infantry over here to try to clear the way. And so then the 7th Michigan's going to get here, make landfall, and try to clear these houses out so that there can be a beachhead. So this monument marks this particular spot. A lot of people don't realize this is actually property owned by the Park Service, so it provides a nice little sliver of that story that otherwise might have gotten lost, because of course Fredericksburg itself has built right up over the years.
So after those Michiganders initially make landfall, they have a shuttling operation where they're going to be going back and forth. They're hauling their wounded and Confederate prisoners back to the other side of the river, and then picking up, the remainder of their regiment, shuttling them back, and then they're going to bring up the rest of the brigade. Well, they're going to bring up 2 more regiments of the brigade by boat, coming back and forth. But that morning, if you can imagine the scene here, shrouded in smoke from all that artillery fire, a lot of close quarters engagement going on right here where we're standing, and then those pontoon boats going as fast as they can. Good point Chris made. They're not designed for speed, but that's what they're being put into here on that morning of December 11th.
My iPad just told me that right now is the Civil War Trust Cookie Exchange, so we're actually missing out on the Civil War Trust Cookie Exchange right now.
My rumbles.
But it also reminds me that somebody asked, is there any preservation opportunities we're working on in Fredericksburg every year? Well, we are still trying to pay off the Slaughter Pen Farm. It is the largest private preservation acquisition of a battlefield in American, if not world history for it. So we always are raising funds for that. And as for the others we may or may not have going on here, can't talk about those. But if you're a member of the Civil War Trust, and I hope you are, or just join our email list, I promise we'll keep you posted on this front. Now, let's set it up a little bit. So the Union Army is coming across. What's next?
All right, so now the name of the game is let's go ahead and buy some breathing room for these troops as they're trying to expand into the city. So the 7th Michigan, they're going to try to go through these houses little by little. Remember, no American soldiers are trained in urban combat street fighting techniques. So again, they're making it up as they go. Unlike our soldiers today who might have methods established for how to clear a house, they don't. So they're just kind of doing it. The 7th Michigan's going to kind of go up as much as they can. They only get about half a block up here, and they run into a lot of Confederate resistance on the next block up. Meanwhile, a Massachusetts regiment, the 19th, has come across by boat. They're going to start to come up on the right side of the street here. So the main axis of advance here is going to be this Hawk Street, which the 7th, the Michiganders are going to be on the left, the 19th Massachusetts on the right. And then On the next block up here, you have Caroline Street that runs parallel with the river. That's where the Mississippians now have kind of fallen back and are offering as much resistance as possible.
Before we head off, I just want to, maybe if I can put Frank O'Reilly on the spot again, because I'm going to point out this particular sign here. This is a piece of interpretation that comes from a bygone era at the park. They used to be everywhere in the park, but they've been replaced by other sorts of interpretive devices. And Frank, as someone who's been here for a long time, can you tell us a little bit of the history of these old signs that a lot of people like?
Well, the old iron markers were classics of the old school of interpretation out on the battlefields, and we used to have literally hundreds of these all across our battlefields. Over the course of the last 20-25 years, most of them have been replaced with much lower profile pieces that have integrated images and pictures, maps, color, to make them a little bit easier to read and look at, relate them better to the ground than maybe just stark text on a background. But the most important thing for us in the modern world is when you look at a great big marker like this, you see the marker, but you don't get a chance to see the land around the marker. So our story is about the land and not the marker itself.
Well spoken, Frank O'Reilly. Chris, let's do a 180. Let's start walking into town. Dan, this is Dan Davis, ECW Civil War author. Set us up.
One of the things that Pete just mentioned is I find very interesting is that the Union Army here is not trained in urban warfare. In fact, it's been 16 years since an American army has engaged in urban warfare. Those of you familiar with the war with Mexico, Zachary Taylor's army will engage in urban warfare in Monterey in 1846.
Very, very cool. Okay, so we are headed what way? West right now?
Yes.
Okay, good. While we're walking, let me say that somebody asked about the pontoon crossings. Why not just, I think it was Tom, why not just put crossings farther outside the city? Well, Burnside, of course, had that idea. He wanted to cross at Skinker's Neck. He wanted to cross at other places. But Robert E. Lee has something to say about that. He's going to send Jubal Early down to Skinker's Neck. He's going to cover the other crossings. And ultimately, it's not like they just crossed at one place. They would cross, if I'm correct, at 3 different places.
That's correct.
Okay, good. What do we got?
All right, so we stopped kind of at this alleyway. This is the point where the Union Army kind of met some resistance, where they have to kind of hold up here and kind of wait for more reinforcements as the Confederates are, holding their ground over here. As I mentioned before, this is frustrating for these guys. This is not the way they're used to fighting. So an example of that frustration plays out in a little scene that the 19th Massachusetts, as they're going through some of these buildings, one of the infantrymen takes his musket and he tries to bust open a door with the butt of the musket. So he's kind of using his musket like this to kind of open up the door. As he's doing that, his musket discharges, so the muzzle is facing rearward, and the bullet travels through the beard of his lieutenant, who becomes rather agitated, and they said that it then led to a long disenfranchisement between the two individuals. But this is an example of what they're going through. This is not what they're trained for. This is things that they're not used to doing, but they're having to find out ways to go about it in this atmosphere, which is very chaotic, and there's a lot going on.
Good. Now, although these buildings aren't necessarily the same, I imagine we'll be getting up to that point where there are a bunch of historic buildings here, but the streets are laid out just like they were?
More or less, yeah. You see a grid from the Fredericksburg city, in 1862. It's pretty similar to today, at least this core section where the battle goes on. This alley is a key feature because this is where the Michiganders kind of stop, and there's a key moment in the battle when another Massachusetts regiment, the 20th, also known as the Harvard Regiment due to a large number of Harvard students and grads in their officer corps, they come up and they're stuck on the bank of the river because there's no room for them to kind of go. And everybody's saying, you need to move. Couch, the 2nd Corps commander, is telling Howard, the division commander, to, break out. And the commander of the 20th Massachusetts comes up here and talks to the commander of the 7th Michigan and says, we're going to move forward up the street and you're supposed to support us. And the Michiganders, they'd had it. They're done. And the major of the Michigan unit says, I can't do that. I'm not going to go forward. And the commander of the 20th Massachusetts starts to walk away, and the 20th or the 7th Michigan major yells out, "No man can live around that corner." And the captain of the 20th Massachusetts yells back, "Go to hell with your regiment then." And the 20th Massachusetts is going to come right up this street and try to secure this intersection that we're going to go up to in just a moment.
Chris, I want to stop us just for a moment because Pete brings up a great point, and then Connor's got a question here she wants to bring. But these guys in the 7th Michigan have fought their way across the river, up the bank, from room to room, house to house to get to this point, and they finally get to this alley. Imagine the relief. This is like the sight for sore eyes. And so they get here, they've got a little bit of cover.
They've got this stone wall here.
And why go forward? You know, at this point, as Pete said, they're done. They've had it. And so they really, you know, they've earned this spot in a way that few regiments are able to earn a spot on this battlefield. So maybe it's a little wonder that they don't want to go forward. But of course, the job still has to get done. And so the 20th Mass is going to go forward. Connor, you had a question for us?
Yeah, and then I think Dan's itching to say something too. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mary asked, is that another witness tree?
It is not.
Yep. Okay.
Okay,
Sorry.
good. Well, that was quick. Dan, take us up a little bit.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, panning back down the street, back toward the crossing, that you'll notice when you come to this battlefield is that if you're a Confederate standing up here walking along the street where we are, we have no view of those Federals coming across after they get onto our side of the river and under the embankment. They're under relative protection due to the embankment, and it gives you an idea, and it reemphasizes the importance of actually coming out to these battlefields and walking the ground to get a better understanding of what happened at these hallowed places.
Good. Barbara asks, you know, how can you learn more about Chatham House? Watch the 2 Facebook Lives we did this morning. I think you'll learn a whole lot. If not, there are a multitude of books out there. But I'm not supposed to hawk books exactly, especially if those people happen to be among us, because the authors here among us right now have written more than 3,000 Civil War books. The number keeps going up. That's right. So what street are we at, and what should we talk about?
This is your intersection of Hawk and Caroline Street. This is going to become pretty much the key to the street fighting at Fredericksburg, at least in my opinion, because this is the intersection that they want to go ahead and control so they can go ahead and bring up reinforcements from the riverbank, because there's a log jam going on back there because there's not enough room for all these additional troops to come across. And at about this time, the engineers are able to finish the pontoon bridge. They're able to go ahead and lay that connection, and now troops are going to be able to just march across. So you want to make sure there's places for them to go. So that's why the 20th Mass, the Harvard Regiment, has been told to go ahead and grab this intersection. Now, these regiments of Barksdale's Brigade and what's now Hall's Brigade, I think this is kind of a neat story. They have faced off against each other at numerous engagements in the war so far. Pretty brutal fights. Ball's Bluff, elements of both these brigades have met each other at the Westwoods and Antietam. They've gone up against each other, and now for a 3rd time at Fredericksburg, they're going to meet face to face. So the 20th Mass is going to come up this street almost in a column formation, enter this intersection, and effectively try to do what the military does today in urban combat, which is to go ahead and secure it, except they're going to do it in a 19th century fashion as opposed to today where they might put some heavy weapons on each corner and control it. They're going to do it where they're going to actually occupy it. So they march up here and they have the 1st company go directly across the intersection, line up across that street, and they're going to be facing west. They've got that control. Next company comes up, they wheel left, and they turn and they're facing south. And the 3rd company comes up, wheels right, and is facing north. So the intersection is effectively sealed and occupied, but they've now created a large stationary target. So all those Mississippians in the surrounding area are going to converge their fire on this one spot. Remember, this is all with daylight fading. It's like, you know, early evening there. So
good.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to point out, too, these guys are always looking for high ground. So where's the high ground here? It'd be the 2nd floors of these buildings, and they're going to be trying to fire down upon them. But if you're a Barksdale's Mississippi and you're inside of these buildings, they're clapboard. And mini balls tend to pass through them. So you're not going to just be wounded by mini balls, you're going to be wounded by straps of glass and from wood coming through.
And actually, talking about the homes, we have quite a few people asking, are any of the homes at this intersection original at all?
In the intersection itself?
Yeah.
No. These ones, a lot of Fredericksburg will be bombed out, and we'll explore that in our next Facebook Live segment. But there are still a lot of pre-Civil War and pre-Revolutionary War homes in the city of Fredericksburg. As Pete pointed out, like 10% of the city is going to be either destroyed or burned out.
Now, if you envision this intersection with soldiers blocking off each of these cross streets, and that crossfire that Pete mentioned. So if you've got sharpshooters in the 2nd floor shooting down, not only then do these guys that are closest to them serve as targets, but if you miss them, you can hit the guys on the far side of the intersection. So these guys are caught in this terrible crossfire that converges from all 4 corners. So do you think these guys want to stand here and take it? Absolutely not. So they're going to get the order to then start clearing out these houses, and units are going to break forward and have to go literally room to room, floor to floor to try to clear out these buildings to give themselves a little breathing room and try to widen their foothold on this intersection.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, here you're on the Civil War Trust Facebook page. You're watching Fredericksburg 155 Live. We're here with all sorts of special guests and in conjunction with the National Park Service here on the battle anniversary, the 12th, 13th. We're going to be all over the place. Hit us with your questions. Hit us with your creative hashtags. We just saw hashtag beard bullet. Chris pointed out to me as well. So the more outlandish, the better. Those things are fun. We're trying to have a positive experience even as we commemorate, a horrific event. We can learn and do that and keep politics out of it as we go. We crossing here?
We are.
Sure. All right.
And somebody brought up some Floridians that would have been down here, quote unquote, fighting too. And I used the quote unquote fighting quite.
It's a rough day for them.
Yeah.
They're kind of set as an afterthought to Barksdale, and they're kind of on the flanks, and they just don't. I guess they have a disadvantage because they haven't been dug in quite as long as the Mississippians, and they don't. Some of them get captured. Some of them are kind of derided by the Mississippians throughout the morning. So it was a few companies, not an entire. A unit as large as the Mississippians have here. But that intersection we just walked through had about 100 casualties sustained in it due to the fact that those Massachusetts troops are trying to occupy it and just the magnitude of fire. Today, people drive through it, walk along, they probably have no idea. But this is a key part of the battle here. And again, where these soldiers are really engaging in urban combat for the first time in a very big way in the Civil War.
And we're walking westward on our way toward Marie's Heights, just so that you all can be oriented. We're much closer to the river than to Marie's Heights at this point, and we're going to keep going on here as we go. Remember, of course, Floridians performed very valiantly and suffered horrible casualties, which is somehow a good thing in the Civil War. Figure that one out. At numerous other battles as we go. So whose path are we on now? Are we with the 20th Mass and the 7th Michigan?
We're with Company I of the 20th Mass, commanded by Captain Henry Abbott, who is a very prolific writer and capable officer and soldier. He kept his calm very well during this engagement. His regimental commander, praised him for that. Abbott felt that standing back there in the intersection and just drawing fire was not a good idea, so he's going to strike out here into the city. Now remember, he doesn't know what's out here, so they're just kind of making their way up the street, and then they're going to try to, get some more ground, get some more breathing room. Anything's better than sitting back in the intersection there. As Abbott kind of gets to this point, he's going to come up against some resistance from some of these Mississippians, and you're going to tell the Lane Brandon story, or does somebody want to go ahead and tell the Lane Brandon story? So basically what happens here is that a captain in one of the Mississippi regiments, or a lieutenant, I'm sorry, finds out that he's going up against his former classmate at Harvard, Henry Abbott, and that gets him pretty fired up. So he decides that he's going to disobey orders he had received from Barksdale to go ahead and pull out as the Mississippians are trying to go ahead and eventually evacuate the city after nightfall, and they're going to go ahead and keep fighting. Eventually someone has to come down and arrest Lieutenant Lane Brandon, the Confederate officer who refused to go ahead and pull his soldiers out. He's pretty obstinate that he wants to go ahead and show his former classmate that he can't be just pushed aside or discounted too easily. So
really cool.
I want to point out, notice how walkable this has been so far. There are monuments down there along Hawk Street at the intersection with Sophia Street. And we've come up 2 blocks. We're at Princess Anne Street now. But one thing you'll notice is that there's not a lot of interpretation downtown in the city. And that's why the Park Services are so important. They do programs during the summer as part of their History at Sunset program, where they do tours downtown and talk about the fighting. Some of the resources that they offer, some of the books that they offer. Frank's book offers some fantastic details about this. Also, take a look at things that you find here at Facebook Live and the Civil War Trust site. That's how you're going to unfold this story, which otherwise gets lost because Fredericksburg has built up so much. You can walk around, the history's here, but it's not told very well or told very clearly. So you kind of got to go digging for some of those resources.
Yeah, and what better place than on the Civil War Trust, Fredericksburg 155 Live. Sorry, I couldn't resist that transition right there. We have about 400 people watching right now. We want to get that up to 500, so share this with other people if you can. The more this proliferates, the better for all of us involved. Someone says hashtag Save Fredericksburg. We have Eric from Mississippi joining us. Good timing in that case right there. Somebody asked whether the streets were cobblestone at the time.
No, actually, these are going to be dirt streets.
All right, dirt streets at the time.
It has sidewalks, it has gas, it has, it's an up-and-coming city because it was insulted in the pre-war days.
Indeed, and if you're talking about 5,000 people, that's more than Los Angeles in 1860 as well. And what was I going to say? Somebody asked whether Gods and Generals was filmed here. No, Fredericksburg is Harper's Ferry. Filmed in Harper's Ferry, actually. Notice the mountains all around Fredericksburg at the time. So, all right, where are we going next, guys?
We can head up this way if you'd like.
And as we walk, we do have another question that I thought was pretty interesting from Rich. He asked, as the new roads went in and all these more modern houses were built, was there any attempted archaeology or anybody find anything interesting? I assume they did.
I mean, there's codes in Fredericksburg because it's protected in a way. I think very interesting working at the park on a regular basis every spring as people do their landscaping and their yard work around here. They bring us all types of things that they will find in the ground. I once had a gentleman come in and put a cannonball on the front desk at the visitor center and tell me he had ran over with his lawnmower. And after I ensured that it was not a fused projectile, he asked me what he could do with it, and I told him it was his property. He could do anything he wanted because if he lived in the city of Fredericksburg, that's now his. So go ahead.
Yeah, tell me, Pete, that he put it down and went and it went through the desk or something like that.
No, not quite.
No, okay. Well, that would have been a better story. So I believe from my incredible internal GPS that we are now headed south.
Correct. Yes. We're headed towards the center of the city. We're going to go see a structure that was here during the battle, the Gordon House, and then we're going to be going in the general direction of where Market Square was, which is where the Mississippians kind of had their command posts. That's where Barksdale had all the reinforcements staged, and also where the Mississippians were told to gather as they just go ahead and leave the city. And that's eventually going to happen because remember, Barksdale's not supposed to hold this town. He's just supposed to delay. And as night approaches, Barksdale wants to wait for the cover of darkness to go ahead and get his troops out of here, as opposed to trying to get them away when the Union Army could still see them and potentially fire at them during their withdrawal.
That delay is particularly important because remember, Robert E. Lee at first didn't realize what Burnside was going to do, so he only has half of his army on the heights back here. Longstreet's corps situated here. Stonewall Jackson spread out to the south trying to cover any other possible river crossings in that direction. And so once Burnside makes his move and commits, that's what allows Lee to start to consolidate his army. So that delay that Barksdale is doing is really giving Lee that time to make that consolidation, and that's why it's so important.
Yeah, they bought about 14 hours for the Confederates here. And after the battle's over, there's all kinds of praise put upon Barksdale's Mississippians for what they did, especially in regards to their numbers. I think Barksdale's going to suffer about 250 casualties out of a 1,500-man brigade. But you think about how the fact he went up against 183 Union guns, a force twice his size, an entire division of the Union Army. And, that's pretty remarkable and by any way you cut it. So.
Yeah, you think if you can buy a couple hours, that sounds pretty good. He gets a whole day, which is pretty phenomenal.
All right, good. Let's keep walking wherever we're walking. I sense we still have a ways to go. I said I wouldn't do this, but I think I'm going to because, you guys gave me a 2-second pause to do so. So let's give a brief stop here and then let's face our guests here. Everybody in for Civil War Fredericksburg middle name trivia. Just call out the person's middle name that I break out, okay? Get in here, Chris, so we can all be... I know this one's a little bit more wide angle. Play at home. See if you can get it right. Even if you're at work, on break, no doubt, just scream it out, okay? William Franklin. Buell. Well done. Winfield Hancock. Scott. Good. Ambrose Hill.
Powell.
William Averill.
Woods.
All right. Look at this. You guys are rocking. Okay. Jubal Early.
Anderson.
And I saw there was an Anderson watching today. Thomas Jackson.
Jonathan.
Good. Okay. Amiel Whipple. Damn. What's that?
Starts with a W?
It is a W. It's a Weeks. I didn't know that either. Richard Anderson. Herron. Good. Daniel Hill.
Harden.
Good. Wow. I didn't even finish it. I think Dan Davis is on fire. William Pendleton.
Nelson.
James E.B. Stewart.
Yule Brown.
Wow. I think we should... No, one more. George W. Getty.
Washington.
Wow, Dan Davis is the winner. Let's keep going, guys. All right, so we're going through town. Are we still following the route of the Massachusetts soldiers?
Yeah, I mean, eventually they're going to be fanning out in the town here, but I guess more so we're following the route of the Mississippians who are making their way back to the market square, trying to gather so Barksdale can get them out of here. A lot's made of how some people think, Barksdale was disobeying orders, and technically did. McLaws, his division commander, tells him to get out of here, but it's still late in the afternoon, and Barksdale thinks that's kind of counterintuitive because it's still daylight. If he just waits a little bit longer for it to be dark, then he can go ahead and get out of here without worry. Now remember, he's in a sticky situation. He's between two armies right now. So the Federals are going ahead and pushing him, and he doesn't want to catch himself in this position where the Confederates, up on the heights can't fire at any Federals coming towards him because he's in between. So waiting for darkness is best. He's going to use a route which will kind of diagonally get him back to the lines as opposed to a straight line of sight where the Federals could go ahead and fire down the length of that. So the market square is about 2 blocks up here, and that's where Barksdale's going to be hanging out. That's where the Mississippians are all kind of congregating.
This is super cool. So we are seeing your reactions. This is a Facebook Live, so you can keep on hitting like, love, or hopefully nothing else as you go along. Let's give a quick stop here. I think we're going to start to wrap things up here, either for connectivity or otherwise. Chris White.
We're actually going to be picking up our next Facebook Live here at 1:30, looking right down Princess Anne Street. We're actually going to be visiting the church that's just out of our view, hidden by some trees. We're up on one of the Fredericksburg plateaus. The city of Fredericksburg sits on essentially 2 plateaus, and we're going to visit both of them. One right here at Princess Anne Street, and then one down on Lower Caroline Street.
Okay, good. This is about what we shoot for. This is about 40 minutes here. Thanks so much for joining us. These and all of our other Facebook Lives that we've done at Gettysburg 153 and Antietam 155, and all of the other, was it Gettysburg 154? It must have been 154 this year, sorry, that we're going to be going along. They're all on our Facebook page. Eventually we'll get them up on YouTube as well, so you can check them out. Stick with us the rest of the day. We'll be up here at 1:30. We'll also be later at an undisclosed location that we know you'll enjoy, and then tomorrow going crazy all day. Let us know what other battlefields you want us to hit. Do you want us to do Chancellorsville 155, Vicksburg 155, Gettysburg 155, Chickamauga 155, and Monmouth 250 or 240 or something like that. So let us know what you want to see. Thank you for supporting battlefield preservation. Thanks for all your kind words that you've been putting up as contact, as comments as we go. Pete, Dan, Chris, Connor, Frank, thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon.